Thank you for joining us on She's with the Band.
In this episode, we hear about Sue's chaotic experience of her first international mega tour with the Beatles. She details the mayhem and dangers of the Beatles' global fame, featuring large crowds, attack dogs, jealous co-workers, and crazy fans.
She's with the band. She's with the band.
This podcast is brought to you by Dover Street Productions and may contain some content that some listeners might find offensive. Let's begin. So, we know that you had the exciting chance to tour with the Beatles at a certain point in the 1960s. Can you tell us how that came about and where you went?
Well, the only time that I went on tour was in Germany. When they revisited Germany after their very humble beginnings in Hamburg.
When was that?
Well, that's where they started off, didn't they? At the Star Club, when they slept in the cubbyhole, all four of them, in the Star Club.
And what year was that?
Well, I think their first single was in 62, wasn't it? So I guess this is when they were there in 60, 61, when all the bands from Manchester, Liverpool, they all went to Hamburg and they played like 5 shows a day and earned nothing. But everybody would go and see the Beatles. Everybody, you name it, any band in Liverpool, Manchester would go to Hamburg because that's where all the action was. That's how they all started.
Okay.
Yeah. They all starved and lived in a garret together. I think they were sort of living in one room and bunk beds. Apparently, in the Star Club, there was like this little hole above the club. It was almost you had to crawl into. That's where they lived. Anyway, this was the first time that they had returned to Germany as mega stars, and it was a 3-night tour of Germany. They were doing Munich, Essen, and Hamburg, which was very exciting. Even though I'd mixed with all these people for 2 or 3 years, I was still pretty naive about a lot of things. And so this was a big deal. And nobody had even discussed it with me and whether it would be covered in person or a freelance would be doing it. It just hadn't come up in conversation. But somebody was going to have to cover it. But I never thought to myself, I wonder if he'll send me. But anyway, maybe a month before, Sean O'Mahony, who was my boss at the Beatles Monthly and the Rolling Stones Monthly, called me into his office and said that he was sending me to Germany. And he just said that he was sending me to Germany, end of. So I was so excited, I can't tell you. Couldn't believe I was actually going. And I remember my mother at the time, she said to me, "You're not going." I said, "What? You can't stop me, it's my job." And I remember my uncle saying, "You can't stop her from going. This is what she does for a living."
How come your mum didn't want you to go?
Oh, well, she thought it was the ruin of me being in the music business anyway. She used to say, if you didn't mix with all those undesirables, she said, you'd be married by now, as all my friends were around their early 20s. Thank goodness I never listened to her because they all got divorced later. So, well, word must have got round at Beatles headquarters that I was going to be covering it. Otherwise, I have no idea how they would have known. And about maybe a week before, maybe 10 days before, I can't tell you, the Beatles were doing Top of the Pops, which I was going down to, because whenever they did any of them, Stones, Beatles, whoever, Ready, Steady, Go, Top of the Pops, I was there. Anything that was filmed in London, I was there. And anyway, Sean called me into his office. He said he'd changed his mind about me going.
Did you ever hear why he changed his mind?
No, he just said he was going instead. I was really, really upset. Well, yeah, I was very impressionable. What are we, 1966 or 5? 66.
66.
I was 20 years old. So off I trot, Top of the Pops. And I'm in the dressing room after, And I was just leaving, and John said, "See you in Germany." And I said, "I'm not going." Like a sulky, petulant child, "I'm not going." And he said, "Why aren't you going?" So I said, "Because Sean wants to cover it himself." So he said, "I'll see you in Germany." But I didn't really think anything of that, and off I went. Anyway, the next morning, I talk about working quickly, he calls me into his office and said, "Oh, a change of plan." He said, "I'm just going to cover the first night in Munich, and you'll be doing the rest of it." So happy, I can't tell you. And I felt that obviously John must have said something. It all happened so quickly. He must have said to Tony Barrow, who's their PR, "Sue's on the tour, make it happen." So the plan was that he would do the first night, Munich. I would fly in to arrive. This is interesting because I had nothing to do with booking the flights, but I would arrive too late for the start of the concert. I don't know what his thinking was about that. He didn't want me at the concert or something. And so I went straight to the hotel. So we were staying at the Bayerischer Hof, which was the best hotel in Munich. I mean, it's still an incredibly good hotel. And so it was only myself and Don Short from the Daily Mirror that stayed at the same hotels as the Beatles. So I went straight to the hotel. And the concert was probably halfway through. I have no idea. And there was a note for me. It was a handwritten note. I can't remember who wrote it at the time. Could have been Neil Aspinall. And
Who was Neil Aspinall?
Well, their roadie at the time. I mean, he's now managing director of Apple Corps, but at the time, both of them, Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall, were their roadies. Neil was more of a personal assistant, and everyone called him Nell. Anyway, said the boys are having a party in their suite after the show. They'd love you to come. So off I went to the party. Must have been late, I guess, because the time they'd come off stage. Who knows what time I rocked up? I don't know. They'd taken over a whole floor of the Bayerischer Hof, the Beatles and their entourage and everything like that. So I guess it was quite late. Anyway, the whole thing's happening in there. Sean O'Mahony wasn't there, I noted. And it was good fun. I knew nobody there except the Beatles and their entourage. And there was a lot of incredibly attractive people. And obviously people like, I would imagine, although obviously I didn't know her, Astrid, who was Stu's. Remember Stu? They called the fifth Beatle, who was John's best friend from art school. He was the original guitarist. And Astrid was a photographer. Astrid could have been there. And people like Klaus Voormann could have been there. They had this group called Paddy Klaus and Gibson. They came to England, the three of them. They'd met them in Germany all those years ago. I think Brian may have managed them for a bit. So people like that would have been there at this party after the opening night. There were lots of very beautiful models there, really good-looking girls, as one would expect when the Beatles were in town. They rounded up the best that the city had to offer. Then the party started petering out, and I guess it had to have been after midnight. And I can remember sitting on the floor talking to George, and then I sort of looked around the room and I went, "Oh," I said, "Where are all those nice girls gone?" He said, "Who?" I said, "All those really pretty girls. They were dressed beautifully." So he said, "They left at midnight." So I said, "What do you mean they left at midnight?" He went, "Sue?" I went, "Yes." He said, "You know what they were?" I went, "No, what were they? Models?" He went, "No, Sue." He said, "They were hookers." I went, "Really?" He said, "Yes, they're not allowed to, the hotel turfed them out after midnight." I went, "Oh, that's how naive I was." So I went back to my room because the next morning we were boarding the train because we travelled by train through Germany. This had never been done before. It was the train that had been refurbished for the Queen a couple of years earlier. So you had staterooms and sitting rooms and with tables, sort of like a dining car. So we were leaving early in the morning for the next stop, that was Essen. But when I got back into my room, there was a message that Sean had called. So I spoke to him the next morning. I must have called his room or something. And he said, well, I called your room last night. Where were you? So I thought, this is my moment. So I said, well, I was with the Beatles. With the Beatles? Where were you? I said, well, they had a party that they invited me to in their suite. There was dead silence on the end of the phone. And I thought, right, I've got even with you now for behaving so appallingly towards me. So off he flew to London. And then we were on the train going to Essen. Well, I'd never heard of Essen, but Essen was an industrial city. And it was very famous in the 40s, well, I guess 30s as well. But Krupp, who made armaments, and he made the arms for the German army, Krupp had his factories there. So it was an industrial town, so not a very attractive town. Not that we saw anything of it, but so this was the first time on the train. And the dining cars had these small menus that said, well, they did it for every meal when we were on the train journey. So it said Beatles breakfast, Beatles lunch, Beatles dinner. And I kept all my memorabilia. I have sold it since, but I kept all things like that. And they had all the things that they had read that the Beatles liked, like cornflakes and all that kind of thing. And when the train was sort of rattling along on its wheels, and when it's going fast, sometimes if it's going very fast, whatever's on the table, especially if you're in the dining car, they all sort of list to one side and you've got to stop everything falling off the table. And Don Short would sit there and he'd go, please God, let the train crash. I was so appalled the first time he said that. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you think I'm here to report what colour socks they're wearing and what they're eating for breakfast, he said, you're mistaken. He said, I'm here in the hope that something major's going to happen and I'll be first on the scene. So this was the current thread. Every time we were having a meal on the train. And then there was a big sitting area with a big table. They had all the artwork out. They were discussing what they were going to call the next album, which had been recorded. They had recorded it, but it was sort of make your mind up time. So everybody was at this table that was connected with it, whether it's assistants, photographer, well, the Beatles entourage, basically, whoever was on tour. So they're bandying all these names about what should we call the album. You know, everybody's throwing their suggestions into the hat. And I remember one of them, it was Rubber Soul, but I can't tell you what the opposition was all those years ago, what the other suggestions were. But it was Rubber Soul.
Do you remember how they came to choosing that name?
No, no one all of a sudden came up with it. I think the names had already been submitted. And it was just a question, well, let's discuss it now. Oh, also on tour, the support act was Peter and Gordon, which was Gordon Waller and Peter Asher. And Gordon had his girlfriend with him. Her name was Sharon Sheely. She was American. And she and I became really good friends for many years. In fact, when I lived in LA for a brief time, for 6 months in 1974, I used to see a lot of Sharon, her and her sister. Sharon Sheely was an absolutely wonderful songwriter. She wrote lots of hits for Rick Nelson. Poor Little Fool was hers. For Brenda Lee. She wrote with Jackie DeShannon. She was just great. And prior to her being with Gordon, she was the fiancée of Eddie Cochran. And it was the most unbelievable story. She told me the story. well, everyone knew what happened to Eddie Cochran because he was on tour in England when he died. She never went on tour with him. They just got engaged, but she never went on tour with him. But for some reason, he called her to ask her to join him. He really missed her. He'd never done that before. So she flew to England. And I have a feeling this, I don't know where the gig was, but I think they were in the Bristol area somewhere when they had that fatal, for Eddie, car crash.
Was she in the car with him?
She was in the car. She was really, really beaten up badly. But the most unbelievable thing, this policeman pulled her out of the car, kind of saved her. I can't tell you if he saved her life. All I know is he pulled her out of the car. And it transpires, well, because at the time he was a policeman. Nobody realised till years later. There was a band in the 60s called Dave D, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Titch. Dave D was the policeman. Unbelievable. Anyway, so Sharon was really nice company for me, actually, because they were all males. So I had a fellow, I had a co-conspirator.
Was this the first time that you met Sharon?
That was the first time I met Sharon. And Gordon was lovely, just lovely. Also on the tour, who was really great, was Peter Brown, who was Brown's right hand, really. He was just great, Peter. I mean, Peter's an incredibly successful PR, has a world-renowned PR company with mega clients. After Brown died, he was very close to John. And in fact, he was immortalised in the Ballad of John Myoko, because the line in the song is, Peter Brown called to say, we'll get married. I can't remember if the line was, we'll get married today in Spain. It sounds really daft that I don't know it, but it wasn't a Beatles song, because I can remember every lyric of a Beatles song. But anyway, so Peter was immortalised in this song. And we arrive in Essen, and it is really, really depressing, this place. It was like being in 1950s Germany, I guess. But the policemen, they looked like soldiers. You know, they had these great big army coats and boots, and they had these Alsatians. And the concert, well, as I hadn't been to the Munich concert, I haven't seen how wild it was, but this concert was absolutely wild. I mean, you couldn't hear them for the screaming.
How many people were in a venue like this?
Oh, I couldn't tell you. It could have been the equivalent of the Odeon Hammersmith, you know, a cinema, 3,000-seater. I have no idea. I can't remember. Something tells me it was a concert hall. And so Peter Brown and I are standing at the very back of the auditorium, and they're just finishing their last number. And obviously the girls knew that their car would be brought round the back, because they would make, you know, guitars down, out the back door and into the limo. So there was a stampede, well, out the back where Peter and I are standing, because there's only the stage. They couldn't get out at the other way. It was the most frightening thing I have ever seen, personally, with me being there. I thought I was going to get trampled on. I mean, Peter practically lifted me up and took me out, flung me out there. And outside, it was carnage out there. They set these dogs on these kids. They set them, and so, and then the tear gas. It was horrendous. It was absolutely horrible. And so they would lose, I don't know if it was the dogs that had done it, or they were just losing pieces of clothing. Shoes were left behind, and it was so frightening, I can't tell you. And so we all jumped into the cars, because we weren't staying in Essen, thank God. So the gig finished at whatever time, 10:30, who knows, I don't know.
Did you go to the concert in Hamburg?
No, what happened in Hamburg was that we arrived at the hotel in the evening because we were staying at this beautiful schloss outside of the city. It was gorgeous. It had a drawbridge and it had a moat, and Don Short's still complaining that nothing dreadful's happened yet. And there was a mix-up with the reservations, obviously. It was only Don and I were staying there. They didn't have my room reservation. So Don's standing there going, you can share mine with me. And I'm going, no, thank you. No, thank you. I'd rather sleep in the chair. And then the guys were deciding what they were going to do in the evening. And the Beatles were deciding whether to chance it or not to go out on the town. And I think that the decision was no. So Don Short, Mike Housego, who was the showbiz writer for the sketch, the Daily Sketch, who was staying not with us, staying in town with all the other music writers, they decided to go out and I should go with them. And they were taking me down to the Reaper Barn. They said I needed to see it. It'll be good.
Did you know what this was?
No, I had no idea. I had no idea. And we're walking down this street. It was incredibly quaint. And there were these little sort of dolls' houses either side of this very narrow street. And they had lattice windows. And they were sort of Tudor looking. And in the window would sit the hooker in her Merry Widow and fishnet tights, you know, and her beauty spots and the hair all back-combed and the black choker around the neck. And I'd never seen anything like this in my life. Never. It's the red light district, basically. It was an eye-opener for me. And then what you did, you opened the window if you wanted to negotiate with the hooker. So one of them rolls up, probably it had to have been Don, I would have thought, and chatting to this hooker, and then comes back to me. And I said, well, what did she say? She said, how much would I pay her? Me. He's saying to me, how much would you pay her? I went, pay her for what? He said, what do you think, Sue? What? I said, oh, don't be ridiculous. So it's like, let's go and have a drink. There were rows and rows of these girls sitting there, some of them really buxom. And we were looking for this particular beer cellar where the Beatles used to hang out in their Hamburg days when they were playing at the Star Club. And we found it, whatever it was called. And in we go to order a drink. Well, I don't know which one of them. It certainly wasn't me. That one of the guys must have said to the bartender or whoever that we were here with the Beatles. Well, that's about the worst thing that they could have said, because this guy, who was obviously the owner, he went mental. He went absolutely mental, waving his arms around, swearing, shouting. He definitely wasn't happy to see us. Well, apparently one of the guys found out that his daughter all those years ago was, what could have been a one-night stand for all I know, but had some kind of a relationship. I'm not sure which one of the Beatles it was, but obviously it was one of them. And he was not happy about it, this owner, and we left very quickly. That's when we went back to the hotel. In the end, they didn't have a room for me. So Bob, it was one of the Bobs that was the photographer on tour. I've got a feeling it was Bob Whittaker. And Bob said, well, you're going to have to share my room with me. And I thought, oh, Christ. And whichever Bob it was an attractive man at the time. And I thought, oh, I don't know what to do here. So I thought, I know. So I went up and had a look at the room. It was a big room and it had a big bed And in those days, all of the girls, because we all had long hair, and we all used to put these massive rollers. We used to sleep in these rollers to get that 60s look, like with the flick at the end. And I thought, I'm going to make myself look incredibly unattractive so he doesn't leap on me. So I did. I put all my rollers in my hair and I like shoved to the far side of the bed. And so what happened then was the next day, there's this photo opportunity. And all the photographers are standing outside of the moat. So we all come out, the Beatles, we've all had breakfast. Everybody comes out. And we're on the drawbridge. And that's where Don does his praying again. Oh, please God, let the drawbridge collapse. And I said, you are impossible. He said, wouldn't that be great? And everybody falls into the moat. I went, not really, no. Great story, Sue.
So after a very eventful few days, you got back to London, and what happened next?
So I came back ready to write everything up. And unfortunately, my father died, who had been ill a long time. So I called Sean and said that I wasn't going to be able to hand my pieces in time. And he wasn't interested. He wasn't interested. He said he wanted these pieces handed in Monday morning to be delivered to his house. I mean, he was not nice people. So I called Maureen O'Grady and said if I gave her my notes, could she write the pieces up, which she did, which was just great. But that's what we all help one another out when we could, you know. And so that's what happened. So basically, that's the end of the Sean O'Mahony episode.
As a quick bonus to this episode, could you read your article on visiting Chiswick House with the Beatles?
This is what I bought this year. So this was in the July 66 Beatles Monthly issue. So it says The Invasion of a Stately Home by Sue Mortner. This is when they were filming Paperback Writer at Chiswick House. So you'd see this on things like Top of the Pops because it accompanied the single. Okay. Like Woburn Abbey or Hampton Court, Chiswick House is open to the public. My reason for going was not to stare at the priceless art treasures which once belonged to the Duke of Devonshire in the 16th century, or to the stroll through the beautiful grounds which are just as famous as the house, but quite simply the Beatles. John, Paul, George and Ringo were filming inserts for British and American TV to coincide with the release of Paperback Writer. And not since Queen Victoria had there been such celebrated guests at Chiswick House. Never had the finely mowed lawns been trodden on by such expensive property since the days of velveteen breeches and buckled shoes. Not being a VIP, I had to leave my car outside the gates, but I noticed a certain Rolls-Royce, Mini and the Austin Princess, all with blacked-out windows, standing in the drive as I approached the house. Where in these massive grounds, I thought, am I going to find John, Paul, George and Ringo? I must have looked rather lost because two workmen who were standing on the roof of the house yelled out, "They're over there," pointing to a mass of trees. So I followed my nose down a narrow path, bumped into an old man on a bicycle who said, "Follow the path round," and finally found myself amongst half a dozen cameramen, but no sign of the Beatles. The affable Vivian Moynihan, who runs the Savile Theatre for Brian Epstein, approached me in her inevitable jolly manner and said, "The boys are in here," ushering me through a secret door in the massive stone wall, which led into one of the private gardens, and there sat John, Paul, George and Ringo on chairs, trying to catch a rare bit of sun. I couldn't have timed it better because Neil and Mal had just brought in a tray of tea and sarnies. "Sit down," said Paul, pulling up a chair. "Would you like a cup of tea?" John was clad in green velvet trousers, polo neck sweater and navy jacket, Paul wore a black jacket and trousers with a beige polo neck and added a touch of suaveness by wearing a pink flower in his buttonhole. Ringo sported a black and navy striped suit with a black polo neck, whilst George favoured a green jacket with green cord trousers and a beige cashmere shirt. All wore metal specs with different coloured lenses. After chatting about the weather, Bruce Johnson of the Beach Boys and Eleanor Rigby, she is a lady who you will be hearing about on the new Beatles LP, Brian Epstein appeared looking lightly tanned as he'd just flown in from Spain to say hello to the boys before flying back the following morning, which, to say the least, was a rather expensive hello. Cries of "the governors have arrived" was interrupted by the voice of Alf, who today was acting as a portable canteen. Alf was their driver, who said, "They're ready for you in the conservatory." So off we marched to the conservatory. At least John and Paul did, in typical army style, plus the salute with heads to the side and bottoms out. Michael Lindsay Hogg, famed director of Ready, Steady, Go, and never without a cigar in his mouth, had everything set up in the public gardens outside the conservatory. Meanwhile, a small crowd of schoolboys had accumulated, plus a handful of girls who worked in the grounds. "Okay, shoot," said Michael. "Camera on Ringo. Look at me, Ringo. Hold it there. Now on to George. Keep looking at me, George." John leaned forward, "But keep looking at me. Hold it there. Sit back now, John. Good. Over to Paul. Hold it there. Cut. Let's try it once more." "You see," said Vivian, coming over to me, "we're fighting against light. The way things are going at the moment, I hope we'll be finished by 6. Otherwise, it'll mean another day's shooting, and the boys have been so good. Poor darlings, they haven't had any lunch. But I told them they could break at 3. The poor darlings didn't look at all faint from the lack of nourishment to me. In fact, I've never seen them looking so well. After signing a few autographs, it was back to the main public park via the meowing peacocks and through the private garden. Of course, the boys had their usual followers, babies in prams and aging folk in bath chairs, plus half a dozen dogs scrambling on the lawns. "Let's go for lunch," said John. "If we don't leave now, it'll be cold. You did order it for 3 o'clock, didn't you, Neil?" Lunch had been ordered at Twickenham Film Studios, which wasn't more than half an hour away. Michael Lindsay Hogg began to panic when he realised by the time they got there and back and ate lunch, there'd be a couple of hours. "You see, boys," he said, "it's the light and it's not going to hold out for much longer." "Oh, the light," said Ringo. "Can't you go down there and bring the food back, Alf?" "It'll be cold," said George, "but you can go and get us some pies." "Or fish and chips," said Paul. "Yes, that's an idea," chirped in Ringo. "Do you think there's anywhere that's open round here?" "I'll see what I can do," said Alf. The boys casually placed themselves on the grass and Michael was ready to shoot again. This time, there were individual shots. First of all, it was all cameras on George, who was peering round a huge stone statue which vaguely resembled Venus de Milo, but only because it was minus an arm. John was too lazy to move, so he stayed sprawled out on the grass. Paul was given a small box to perch on, plus another box to put his feet on. Whilst this was going on, Ringo had been plucking daisies and placing them in the links of his identity bracelet, the reason being that when the cameras moved in on Ringo, he just sat cross-legged pulling out each daisy one by one. Up until now, all the camera shots had been mute, and now they were ready for the boys to mime to paperback writer. With guitars in hand and Ringo leaning against a stone pillar, they mimed their new single to a crowd of schoolgirls and boys, which had grown considerably since the last count. Just as they'd finished shooting, Alf arrived with the lunch, which he'd brought over from Twickenham Studios, hot. Because of the crowd of fans that had already gathered, lunch was served in the back of the Austin Princess and consisted of chops, new potatoes, peas, cauliflower, with the exception of Paul, who had cold meat and a salad, and a bottle of red wine with rice pudding to follow. Meanwhile, some schoolboys came over to inform me that at 4 o'clock, the 2 schools opposite would probably make a mass exodus over to the park, as word had got around that the Beatles were filming. As soon as I told John, Paul and Ringo, they left their rice puddings and hurried over to the beech tree to continue shooting. Whilst John, Paul and George were being arranged on the branches of the tree and Ringo was being placed on top of a stone pillar, large numbers of fans started to arrive. Of course, the inevitable happened when everyone downed tools to make their way back to the garden. The crowd of onlookers broke loose and it was everyone for themselves. At least it was for John, Paul, George and Ringo. And as usual, they managed to come to no harm with the help of Mal, Neil, Alf and press officer Tony Barrow. After seeing them safely reinstalled in the other garden, I bid my farewells and made for the door in the wall.
Do you remember that day quite vividly?
I remember that day really well. I was an Austin princess. I thought it was John's Rolls. I can remember sitting in having lunch. Oh, there it is. Look, there they are, sitting in it.
Oh, yeah. In the next episode of She's with the Band, Sue explores never-before-told stories of scandals, drunk driving, and mischievous late-night adventures with some of the biggest names in music history.
She's with the band.